I noticed the prompt mentions a file 10 noxdnguy.txt with previously used character names, but no such file was attached. I'll create the story with fresh names. If any happen to overlap with your existing list, just let me know and I'll swap them out. My attorney grabbed my arm in the hallway outside the courtroom and said, "Evelyn, if you sign those papers today, I cannot protect you. Please do not do this." I looked at her, smiled, and walked through the door anyway. Everyone in that room thought I had lost my mind. My daughter thought grief had finally broken me. My son-in-law thought I was too old and too tired to fight. And my husband of 43 years, standing on the other side of that conference table with his 29-year-old girlfriend and a smirk he didn't bother to hide, he thought he had won. None of them knew what I knew. Let me start from the beginning because none of this makes sense without it. I married Gerald when I was 24 years old. He was 27, just out of the Army, working at his uncle's flooring company in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was a bookkeeper at a dental practice 3 blocks away. We met at the diner on Glenwood Avenue where we both ate lunch on Tuesdays. He always ordered the patty melt. I always ordered the soup. The waitress used to joke that we were proof that opposites attract. We built a life the slow way, the honest way. Gerald took over the flooring company when his uncle retired in 1995, and I left the dental office to manage the books for the business full-time. We had one daughter, Renee, who grew up watching her father lay hardwood floors in other people's houses and watching her mother balance ledgers at the kitchen table after dinner. We weren't wealthy, but we were solid. We owned our home. We put Renee through college without loans. We had a retirement account that Gerald liked to call our Golden Years Fund, like it was something precious, something we'd built together. And I want to be clear about that, I wasn't just the wife in the background. I was the one who caught the billing errors, who negotiated with suppliers, who set up the LLC structure when Gerald wanted to expand in 2003. The business ran on his hands and my brain, and we both knew it, even if he was the one whose name was on the sign above the door. For 43 years, I thought we were partners. Then in the spring of 2024, I started noticing things. Small things. At first, Gerald coming home later than usual. A new gym bag in the back of his truck that I'd never seen before. He'd always hated the gym. Twice I called his cell phone in the early evening and he didn't pick up. Then texted me 20 minutes later saying he'd been in the warehouse. The warehouse didn't have reception problems. I'd worked there for 20 years. I didn't say anything right away. I told myself I was being paranoid. Gerald was 68 years old. We had grandchildren. I thought about the 37 years of fidelity I knew about and tried to use it as a counterweight against the feeling that had settled in my stomach like a stone. But the feeling didn't go away. In June, I found a receipt. It had fallen between the driver's seat and the console in his truck. I was looking for a pen, and it was for dinner at a restaurant in Durham called Oleander. Gerald had told me he'd been at a supplier meeting that night. Oleander wasn't a supplier meeting kind of place. It was the kind of place with candles on the tables and a wine list printed on cardstock. The receipt was for 2 people. The total was $212. I put the receipt in my pocket. I didn't confront him. I went inside and made dinner and sat across from him and watched him eat and talk about a job they'd just landed in Cary. And I thought, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with before I say a word. I hired a private investigator the following week. His name was Dale Pritchard, and he'd been recommended to me by a woman in my church whose own suspicions had turned out to be correct 3 years prior. Dale was methodical and quiet, and he didn't make me feel foolish for being there. He told me to give him 2 weeks. It took 10 days. Gerald was seeing a woman named Amber who worked at the title company they used for some of their commercial transactions. She was 29. Gerald was 68. Dale sent me photographs and a 2-page summary that I read sitting in my car in the parking lot of the Harris Teeter on Falls of Noose Road. I sat there for 45 minutes. Then I drove home, made a grocery list in my head, went back inside, and bought the things we needed for the week. I didn't cry until that night after Gerald had gone to sleep. I stood in the bathroom with the water running so he wouldn't hear me. I let myself have that night, just that one night. After that, I got very calm, very focused. I have always been a woman who processes grief quietly and then moves. It's how I was raised. My mother used to say that falling apart was a luxury, and she wasn't wrong. Not always. I made an appointment with a family law attorney named Sandra Okafor, who had an office in downtown Raleigh and a reputation that 3 different people had mentioned to me independently over the years. I brought everything I had: the business formation documents, the tax returns going back 10 years, the retirement account statements, the deed on our house, and Dale's report. Sandra spent 2 hours with me that first meeting. She was sharp and direct, and she didn't soften things unnecessarily. She told me that North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, which means marital property gets divided fairly, but not necessarily 50-50. She told me that my contributions to the business, documented ones, which I had, would count. She told me I was in a better position than I thought. Then she said something that changed everything. I want you to look at these business accounts very carefully before we move forward, she said. You've been managing the books. Has anything seemed off to you recently? I told her I'd stepped back from day-to-day bookkeeping about 18 months ago. Gerald had hired a part-time office manager, a young woman named Jessie, to handle the routine stuff. He'd told me I deserved a break. I believed him. Sandra asked me to pull the last 8 quarters of records if I could access them. I could. My login to the accounting software had never been revoked. Gerald assumed I'd stopped caring. I spent 3 evenings going through those files after he went to bed. What I found took my breath away. There were payments to 2 vendors I didn't recognize, names that sounded legitimate: Piedmont Supply Group and Triangle Materials, LLC, totaling nearly $340,000 over the past 18 months. I cross-referenced them against our supplier list from before I'd stepped back. They weren't there. I searched the North Carolina Secretary of State's Business Registry. Piedmont Supply Group had been registered 14 months ago. Triangle Materials, LLC, 16 months ago. I searched further. Both LLCs listed the same registered agent. I wrote down the agent's name, closed the laptop, and called Sandra the next morning. Her response was very quiet. Then she said, "Evelyn, I need you to stop logging into those systems right now. Don't touch anything. Don't move any money. Don't download anything else. I'm going to bring in a forensic accountant, and we need to do this correctly." She paused, then added, "This may be more than a divorce case." I understood what she meant. Gerald confronted me 3 weeks later, not because he knew what I'd found. I don't think he did, but because Amber apparently wanted things to be official. He came into the kitchen on a Saturday morning while I was drinking my coffee, and he sat down across from me and said that he wasn't happy and hadn't been for a long time, and that he thought we should separate. I asked him if there was someone else. He said that wasn't the point. I looked at him for a long moment. This man I had built 43 years with, this man I had protected and organized and believed in, and I said, very calmly, "All right, Gerald, if that's what you want." He seemed surprised that I didn't argue. I think he'd expected tears, or accusations, or begging. He got none of those things. What he got instead was me telling him I'd contact an attorney the following week, and then I poured myself a second cup of coffee. The divorce process took about 4 months to reach the settlement stage. Sandra worked deliberately. The forensic accountant she brought in, A man named Roger Tate, who had testified in federal court cases and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had seen everything twice, confirmed what I suspected. Piedmont Supply Group and Triangle Materials LLC were shell companies. The payments flowing to them were fraudulent. Gerald had been systematically diverting money from the flooring business, our business, for at least 16 months. The working theory was that he'd been moving funds into accounts Amber had access to, building a nest egg outside of the marriage that wouldn't show up in a divorce settlement. The total amount, $342,000. Sander explained what we could do with this. We could report it directly to the DA's office. We could report it to the IRS since the fraudulent deductions had likely affected the business's tax filings. Or we could use it as leverage in the divorce settlement. Or, she said, leaning forward slightly, we let him think he's winning first. She explained the strategy. Gerald's attorney was pushing for a settlement that gave Gerald the business, valued at approximately $1.2 million, and gave me the house, which we owed very little on and was worth about $380,000 plus a portion of the retirement accounts. On the surface, Gerald's side was framing this as generous. In reality, I would be walking away from the business I had co-built for decades with far less than my share. But if Gerald believed I had accepted this out of exhaustion or grief or simply not understanding what I was worth, he would sign quickly before anyone started asking questions about those shell companies. Once he signs and believes the case is closed, Sander said, we file to set aside the settlement on grounds of fraudulent concealment. He hid assets. That voids the agreement. And then we hand everything over to the IRS and the DA. I sat with that for a moment. He'll lose more than the business, I said. Significantly more, Sanders said. I asked her how certain she was that this would work. She said the evidence Roger has documented is not ambiguous. The question is whether you're willing to let him walk out of that room thinking he's beaten you. I told her I'd spent 43 years being underestimated by that man. One more afternoon wasn't going to hurt me. The settlement conference was held on a Thursday in October. Gerald came in with his attorney, a man named Forsyth, who wore a suit that was slightly too expensive for the occasion, and spoke to my attorney with the careful condescension of someone who thought this was already over. Amber was not in the room, but I knew she was nearby. Gerald had started bringing her to things. Two things. Like I wouldn't hear about it. I sat across the table from my husband of 43 years and I watched him try not to look too pleased with himself. The terms were laid out. Gerald got the business. I got the house and approximately 40% of the retirement accounts. There were other minor assets divided between us. It was, by any reasonable measure, a deal that heavily favored Gerald. Sandra passed me the signature page. Under the table, she pressed 2 fingers against my wrist. Our signal. Everything's in place. I picked up the pen. I felt Gerald exhale. I signed. Gerald's attorney gathered the documents quickly, like he was afraid I might change my mind. Gerald himself stood up and offered me his hand, which I thought was one of the more extraordinary moments of my life. My husband of 4 decades, shaking my hand like we'd just completed a business transaction, which I suppose we had. I hope you'll be all right, Evelyn, he said. I will be, I told him, and I meant it completely. 2 weeks later, Sandra filed the motion to set aside the settlement. Gerald's attorney called our office 4 times in the first hour after receiving it. Gerald himself appeared at my door that evening with Amber in the passenger seat of his truck, which I found almost impressive in its audacity. He knocked. I opened the door with the chain still on. Evelyn, this is harassment, he said. We had an agreement. We had a fraudulent agreement, I said. Your attorney will explain the distinction. You don't know what you're talking about. I know what Piedmont Supply Group is, Gerald, I said. And I know what Triangle Materials is, and I'm fairly certain the IRS will find it just as interesting as I did. The color drained from his face. Amber said something I couldn't hear from where I was standing. "You need to talk to your attorney," I said. "Good night." I closed the door. I won't pretend I didn't stand in my hallway for a few minutes with my heart pounding. I'm 67 years old, not made of stone. But underneath the adrenaline was something much steadier, something I hadn't felt in months, possibly longer. The IRS investigation was opened the following spring. The evidence Roger Tate had compiled was turned over as part of the legal proceedings, and what emerged was more extensive than even we had initially suspected. Gerald had been routing money through the shell companies for purposes that went beyond hiding assets from me. There were tax implications that his accountant was also going to have to answer for. The business, once the forensic accounting became known to Gerald's commercial lenders, came under additional scrutiny. Two of his major commercial contracts were put on hold pending resolution. The original settlement was formally set aside by the court 4 months after I signed it. A new settlement process began, this time with full financial disclosure required, and Roger Tate's documentation as the foundation. The division of the business was recalculated based on my actual contributions, the years of bookkeeping, the administrative infrastructure I'd built, the supplier relationships I'd managed. Sander argued, and the mediator agreed, that my role had been substantially that of a co-owner regardless of whose name appeared on the original LLC filing. In the end, I received 51% of the business valuation, liquidated because neither of us wanted to continue operating together, plus my full share of the retirement accounts, plus the house. Gerald received what remained after his legal fees, which were considerable, and after the IRS matter was resolved, which cost him additionally. Amber, from what Renee told me later, had moved on by the time the investigation concluded. Renee sat in my kitchen the evening after the final settlement was signed and said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me what you were doing?" I poured us both a glass of sweet tea and sat down. "Because I needed you to believe I was just sad and tired," I said. "If you'd known, you might have said something, or your face might have given something away." Gerald watches people's faces. She was quiet for a moment. "You've been 3 steps ahead this entire time." "I've been keeping the books in this family for 43 years, I said. "I know where every dollar goes." She laughed, the kind of laugh that's close to crying, and then she reached across the table and took my hand. "I sold the flooring business to a young couple who had been in the industry for 12 years and had been looking to acquire an established operation in the Triangle area. They were good people, detail-oriented, professional, the kind who asked the right questions. At closing, the younger of the two shook my hand and said, "Ms. Evelyn, we're going to take good care of it." I believed her. With my share of the proceeds, I paid off the house completely. I put the majority into an investment account that my financial advisor, a woman I'd been working with since 2018, helped me structure for the long term. I kept a portion liquid because I am a bookkeeper at heart and I believe in having reserves. I also booked a trip to Savannah, Georgia, because I had wanted to go for 30 years, and Gerald had always said it was too far for a weekend and too expensive for a real trip. It turned out to be neither. I walked along River Street in the October sun with my good shoes on and a cup of coffee in my hand, and I thought about what 43 years looks like from the other end. It doesn't look the way you expect. It doesn't look like failure even when it ends badly. It looks like a very long education. I learned that a woman who has spent decades being the invisible engine of a partnership carries more power than anyone, including herself, often realizes. I learned that documentation is not paranoia, it is self-respect made practical. I learned that grief and strategy are not opposites. You can cry in a parking lot on Tuesday and walk into an attorney's office on Wednesday with every document in order. And I learned that the moment your opponent believes you've given up is the most powerful moment you will ever have. My daughter asked me once, near the end of all of it, whether I regretted staying so long. It's a question I've turned over many times. What I came back to was this: I don't regret the years I believed in something real, because for a long time it was real. What I regret is the years I made myself smaller to keep the peace. The times I deferred when I should have held my ground. The times I let him think the business was his idea, his achievement, his name above the door. But regret, I've found, is most useful when it points forward. So I use it that way. I'm 67 years old. I own my home free and clear. I have a daughter who calls me every Sunday and 2 grandchildren who think I hung the moon. I have a financial advisor and a good attorney and a forensic accountant I sincerely hope I never need to call again, but whose number I've kept. I have my name on my own accounts now. I have my own passwords. I have a bookkeeper's habit of checking every line. And I have something Gerald always underestimated, right up until the moment he couldn't: the patience to wait until the numbers tell the whole story. I still think about that parking lot sometimes. The Harris Teeter on Falls of Noose Road, a Tuesday afternoon, Dale's 2-page report sitting open on my lap, 43 years condensed into photographs and a summary I could have read in 4 minutes but took 45 to get through because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. What I've come to understand, looking back, is that Gerald's unraveling wasn't something I caused. It was something he built, slowly, quietly, one dishonest decision stacked on top of another. And what I did was simply refuse to be buried underneath it when it collapsed. The shell companies, the diverted money, the careful construction of a second life at the expense of the one we'd made together, none of that happened because of me. And none of it was going to be undone by me crying or begging or signing whatever papers he put in front of me without reading them first. Consequences have a way of arriving on their own schedule. What we control is whether we're standing clear when they do. I think about the kind of woman I had to become to get through those months. Not harder exactly, more honest maybe. Honest with myself about what I actually knew, what I had actually built, what I was actually owed. For a long time I had let Gerald's confidence in himself substitute for my own. He was the face of the business, the one who shook hands at trade shows and whose name was above the door, and I had quietly decided somewhere along the way that this meant the business was more his than mine. It wasn't. I knew that in the part of my brain that balanced ledgers, even when the rest of me had forgotten it. That's the thing nobody tells you about intelligence. Not the showy kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet working kind that accumulates over decades of paying attention. You don't always know you have it until you need it. I had been keeping the books for 43 years. I knew where every dollar went. When Gerald stopped wanting me to know, the discrepancy was loud, even if I was the only one listening. And then there was the matter of simply enduring, of not falling apart when falling apart would have been the easier thing, of going home and making dinner and sleeping in the same bed and waiting, not passively but deliberately, while Sandra and Roger built something that would hold. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table after Gerald went to sleep and thought, I am 67 years old, and I am doing the hardest thing I have ever done, and no one in this house knows it. That thought didn't break me. It steadied me, because I knew that what I was doing was right, and I knew that right things, done carefully and honestly, tend to hold their shape. Gerald made his choices. I made mine. His were built on hiding and taking and assuming I wouldn't notice or wouldn't act. Mine were built on documentation, patience, and the deep stubbornness of a woman who had worked too hard for too long to walk away with less than she'd earned. The numbers told the whole story in the end. They always do.